Hello, everyone, and welcome to APQC's August KM webinar, Measure Knowledge Through the Lens of the Business. And I am really excited for this one because we get a lot of questions around measurement, and particularly how to measure in a way that will resonate with all of your stakeholders, your leaders, everybody who needs to fund and sponsor and promote and also participate in KM in order for it to work right and be sustainable. And so our goal today is to help you think as broadly as possible about the kinds of metrics that will matter in your organization, and then share some of our methodology around what we think of as business relevant measurement. So this is our pretty simple agenda for this call. It really breaks down into 4 parts. First, we're going to talk about why you measure KM impact, all the reasons that you measure and why those business value, business outcome measures matter in particular. And then we're going to talk about what to measure. So different kinds of KPIs, key performance indicators that you can look at, and how you choose and prioritize those measures effectively, both on the KM side and on the business side. And then we're going to get more into the how-to of how you analyze that data and how you draw connections between what's going on in KM and maybe some things that are important to the business. And then final piece, we're going to talk about how you communicate those metrics and insights. So once you've picked your measures and correlated your data, how you share that with stakeholders and talk about it in a way that's cohesive and credible and compelling. So my name is Lauren Trees. For those of you who don't know me, I lead the Knowledge Management Research Program here at APQC. And I am joined by 2 of my fantastic colleagues. Cindy, do you want to introduce yourself first?
Thank you, Lauren. I'm a lifetime learner in knowledge management, and I am the executive director for our client solutions, which means I get to work very closely with our members and clients and bring the best of content that Lauren is responsible for and deliver services that Darcy Lemons is responsible for. Darcy?
Hi, everyone. Darcy Lemons. So glad to have you with us today. And like Cindy, I too am a lifelong learner in the field or discipline of knowledge management. And I have the privilege of working with so many of your organizations to help you all do whatever it is you desire with knowledge management. Stand up a strategy, set up some communities of practice, assess the maturity of your KM capabilities. And just grateful to be here today with my colleagues to talk a little bit more, one more time, about KM and measurement. Lauren?
Well, and it's great because those of you who are KM webinar regulars here at APQC may remember that the 3 of us did a webinar on KM maturity assessment back in April. And I see today as a bit of a follow-on to that. Assessing your knowledge management maturity is going to tell you what kind of progress you've made in your program and how well you're doing KM. Whereas this measuring through the lens of the business is going to tell you how that progress, how the KM activities that you're enabling are affecting the business themselves. So I think they pair well together really well. So I wanted to start by talking about the fact that most KM programs at various stages of development are measuring something. They have data, but especially programs that are maybe younger and a little bit less developed, they tend to really focus on KM data that the KM program is tracking about itself. So how many people are part of communities of practice? How many lessons learned are being documented? Maybe what pieces of content people are downloading from repositories? And maybe even how happy users are with some of those resources. And all of that data is important. If nobody is participating in KM, then you're not going to get any impacts, and you need to know that. And if people don't like it or they don't feel like it's helping them, then you need to know that as well. But I think that KM programs can get really caught up in this operational data and think they're doing all this measurement. And then someone outside of the KM program comes in and says, well, that's nice, but so what? That's great that you've added 1,000 content items to your repository and 90% of your communities are achieving their target health score. but why should I care about any of this? And why should I invest or let my employees spend time on it, more pointedly? So as a KM team, I think you always want to have an answer to that so what question. That's really important. And some outcome that you can point to that the business cares about. So I think that we're going to talk a little bit more about why we measure KM impact, and I'm going to pass things over to Cindy for that.
Thank you, Lauren. I'm going to tell you all, she did make me promise, since I've been at this for over 2 decades, and yes, in 1995, I kept saying, we should probably measure this stuff. So I've been on this lifelong journey with knowledge management to measure. And so the question is, why measure it? But my question is always, why not, right? So the point of all of this is, I think that just winding the clock back a little bit, not taking you too far down and deep into memory lane. But it was very hard at first, because in order to measure impact, you have to have activities going on. And that's what we worked so hard as a community, you all did, trying to build those activities and getting people participating, as Lauren just said. And then in 1998, one of our early research projects, and we had been doing some services, we started seeing people really being able to correlate those activities to some outputs. And if you stretched it a little bit further, you could get it to the outcomes. And really savvy leaders were asking questions like, well, what are we investing in? And why does it matter? And what are we getting for our money? And hopefully those are some of the questions that your sponsors and your leaders and your advocates are asking. But as good KM leaders, I know that you're already making it to that point. So look, there's 2 points as we move to the next slide. There's 2 points I want to talk about, and I've stated them very early on. There's really 5 reasons, and in this, they sort of give you a hint of what kind of measures are important. When you look at the left-hand side for the knowledge management group, the team that's important, that's your set of operational measures. You're just trying to make sure you're offering the best to your audience that you can, that we have, as Lauren said, things that we need to be doing where knowledge is going to have an impact. We have processes and capabilities and approaches that will help that knowledge flow. It also keeps us very targeted, because those of you who know, after a little bit of success, everyone comes and wants you to help them. And there's a limit to what you can do depending on the resources that you put in place. So this starts giving you an idea of what you're investing in, which ones work. As you said, as Lauren said about the maturity model, you can start recognizing problems and say, we have more tacit knowledge that we need to focus on right now than our explicit knowledge. So let's make sure we course correct and the approaches that we have to make that happen are sound and repeatable, so we can improve those every time we use them, hundreds, if not thousands of times daily in some of your organizations. And it also can help you reveal where you're doing really well and where you may not. Now, all of that is well and good. As I said earlier, can you measure the value of knowledge management? Yes, you can. But it takes a little bit more effort, because, as I said, savvy leaders know that knowledge sitting in a database has no value. But knowledge in action, which is our goal as KMers, at least has the potential of getting results, better sales and selling approaches, avoiding mistakes and reworking your operation, and linking people to expertise. Those are all things that we're trying to achieve, and you have to be able to demonstrate that. And that's where, as we go through today, you're going to see some important things that we think you need to pay attention to. Sometimes you're not getting the results that you need. You can go back and tweak those just a little bit in terms of how your measurement capabilities are actually working. And so you want to become more predictive in terms of knowledge needs, what type of approaches you need to be putting in place, and what technologies need to be there to enable and support that knowledge. And then, of course, Lauren's going to be wrapping us up today talking about communication and how you really get them. These are our big reasons on why to measure. And I think I get really excited. While this data is from our 2018 KM program benchmarks and metrics, I think you'll see that, yes, we are doing a pretty darn good job when we start looking at getting feedback, satisfaction, adoption, participation. Stories are still so important. Satisfaction, that's all important. But look at the bottom two. Where this is going to take us today is we've got to continue to strive for that impact on business outcomes and return on investment. And it didn't take APQC very long to realize when we finally saw that return on investment in several of the projects that we were working on, and some of our research projects where a group of you came together and worked through this. We begin to see that return on investment. And in many cases, it's 2-to-1 return, up to a 5-to-1 return. And we continue to see that. Our goal is always, for 20 plus years, we want to flip this and make sure that the methods we're using to show impact are at the top of this chart. So what I'd like to know today, and I've got a poll, I think, coming up here. Yeah, Anna, there we are. I'd like to just kind of get a read, Lauren, on what this audience is doing. Does your organization measure KM impact? And that impact can be, again, on ROI. It can be on outputs. A lot of you talk a lot about cycle time, accelerated learning, and the time it takes to competency. That would all be considered in the first category. Do you measure non-financial business impact, more qualitative type things? Or do you capture anecdotally but not in metrics, or no, not at all? And I think we've limited you all to a single choice.
And I realize I probably should have asked people whether they calculate financial impact and non-financial impact. So I think if you're doing both of those, I would choose the financial impact, and that'll give us a sense of where people are on that measurement track. But yeah, as I was looking into that question, I was like, oh, I should have given people a both option.
It's our focus today. Oh, well, look at that, Lauren.
Yeah, a lot of people measuring both the non-financial impact and especially doing this anecdotally, but not in metrics. And I think the anecdotes are so important, and we're going to talk about that when we get to the communication piece. But they're particularly powerful when you can pair those two things together, when you've got the data and the stories and you can combine them.
Absolutely. And listen, guys, and not to be a doom and gloom, because measurement is my favorite capability for knowledge management. But look, if you're saying no, or just anecdotally, I will tell you all, in our years and experiences, I'm going to borrow my colleague Lauren Tree's words, we've seen some spectacular failures in knowledge management. And so pay attention as we go into what we're going to measure, how you're going to do it, and finally then how you're going to let your audience engage in that, because you can measure the impact, and we've been there, we've done that. So Lauren, I'll let you take it away.
Absolutely. And I think just a final thought on this is that we have seen some spectacular failures. And the flip side of that is that having those value measures helps build the sustainability of your KM program, because you are always only one leadership change or strategy change away from maybe losing the person who implicitly believes in KM. And you have a new, more skeptical person come in and say, so what's the point of this? And it's really helpful. And we see that in terms of the ease of budget approval and, effectiveness ratings from leaders, that those programs that have those outcome measures do perform better.
It's risky when that new person is your CFO or your chief operations officer.
And it's their job to ask those questions, and you just want to have good answers for them.
Absolutely.
So I want to talk a little bit more about the what to measure piece. So hopefully we've convinced you that this is something worth doing. And I want to talk about what KPIs you may want to focus on, and when you want to measure this knowledge through the lens of the business, rather than measuring KM, health or the activity piece. So we're going to kind of talk a little bit about both here. Because I do want to start with this big picture, which is your full portfolio of measures. This is your dashboard, 4 major categories, and all of them are important. You do need those activity measures. How many people are doing KM? How much knowledge is moving through the pipes, whatever your KM approaches look like. And you also need some process measures, because you can have lots of activity that is just noise and not creating a lot of value. We see that frequently when organizations set up quotas or incentives for people to share a lot of knowledge, and they're throwing stuff in the system, they're writing comments, but it's just junk that's junking up your system because they're doing it because they want to get points or they want to reach their quota or whatever. So you need some quality measures, some process measures there as well. We talked a little bit earlier about the maturity measures. That's going to give you that bigger picture view of how the KM program is progressing and where you may have gaps. And then finally, you do really want those value measures. And it looks like, maybe a third of you, maybe a little bit more, are already doing that. And that's really where we're going to focus the rest of today, because even if you are doing some of those value measures, I think that there's some opportunities to maybe look at that a little bit more broadly and think about it in a larger context. So I typically break value measures into two main categories: those financial impacts and other types of business impact. And when KM leaders call me up or call Cindy or Darcy up, asking how to measure business value, they're usually really focused on this financial impact. How can I show that KM makes the organization money or saves the organization money, and in particular, more than what the KM program costs? And a lot of organizations ask KM to provide that kind of business case, and that's fine. So there are many ways to measure financial impact. Some are more straightforward than others. You can look at cost savings. That's our first category. So that's either where KM has directly saved the organization money, and that's a little less common, a little harder to measure. Or you can measure maybe how much time employees save looking for information and translate that into a cost savings. Or maybe you're able to take some intellectual property and reuse it in a new project, and you can capture some cost savings from that. And the next category we really look at is cost avoidance. And we most often see that when organizations assign a dollar value to best practices, lessons learned, something that they're capturing, for example, out of projects. And then, if a project learns something really important and the organization, determines that applying that lesson moving forward will save $1 million every time we apply it. And if it gets applied to 3 more projects, then you have cost avoidance of $3 million, for example. And then you have this positive side of the balance sheet. If KM helps you land clients or sales, you can track that as financial impact. Or if you can show that KM has an impact on things like customer retention or upselling existing customers, then you can sell that as well. I always think of our old friends at Nalco Water when I think about this follow-on revenue category, because they were able to correlate that when they had sales and service staff, who went out in the field, who had access to KM resources, that was able to drive up customer loyalty. And so that was kind of in the revenue side of the correlation of their financial impact. And that was powerful to their leaders because customer loyalty was really important to them. So financial impacts are great, but I think thinking about business value only in those terms can be really limiting. And that's one of the mistakes that I think we see people make. Organizations track and care about all kinds of KPIs that are not directly related to profitability. So measuring through the lens of the business is about determining what metrics the business cares about and seeing if you can show a relationship between KM and that thing, whatever it is. So we tend to talk about these KPIs here at APQC as knowledge-sensitive business measures. So they're business measures that you may be able to influence, nudge, ooch in the right direction with applying KM in the right way. And there are all sorts of knowledge-sensitive measures. The right ones are going to depend on your industry, your business strategy, your annual goals, and so on. But I'm presenting a few common categories today, and we've got a white paper on this that's linked at the end of the webinar. So the first 2 categories are more core or foundational, and that's your operations and competency measures. So most organizations have a range of operational measures around efficiency, quality, safety in some industries. And looking at those operational KPIs and seeing if you can show an influence from KM, that can be really powerful. We've seen manufacturing organizations do this, where, for example, one aerospace company was able to show a relationship between participating in communities of practice and how many items per project they had without defects. So that's a good example. Quality measure, you may not assign an exact dollar value to it, but if the organization cares about it, then it matters. Competency measures are another foundational area, and we have a lot of members that are talking about the Great Resignation. They're worried about skills gaps. They're worried about bringing staff on. So, if you can show that, you can improve succession management through knowledge transfer, reduce time to competency for key roles through KM, that can be really powerful. Again, even if you can't assign a specific dollar value to it. And then the next three categories are more strategic or dynamic. A lot of organizations are trying to become more innovative and agile right now, and also to embrace digital transformation. Nope, we're not done talking about digital transformation. So there may be specific KPIs that are tied to some of those initiatives or goals that KM can connect to and help support. Innovation can be a really good area because the organization tends to track a lot of data around it, especially if it's an innovation or R&D driven organization. So if you can correlate data around how KM boosts innovation activity, that can be very compelling. Knowledge is critical to a lot of automation, AI type digital implementations. So if you can show KM specific value there by tying it to some of the KPIs in those digital transformation projects, again, very compelling. And we've also seen a lot of interest across the business in speed metrics really recently, whether it's decreasing time to market, increasing the speed of problem resolution, which are all things that I kind of, think about in terms of agility, especially in the world of perennial pandemic. And so if those are things your organization tracks, you may want to correlate those metrics. And risk response is also, part of agility and part of these knowledge sensitive measures that I think some organizations don't consider. We worked with a health insurance company that was able to show that when its customer service employees used KM, they were able to solve patients' problems faster, and they were also less likely to dispense incorrect information that put the patient and the company at risk. So you got kind of a 1-2 punch of things that were important to leaders because they don't like risk very much. And then I wanted to bring up a few sort of practical considerations when you're choosing metrics. When you're aiming to measure KM through the lens of the business, you really want to use existing data wherever possible. Do not reinvent the wheel unless you absolutely have to, and make sure that you do. If you're looking for business metrics to track to, the best options are going to be KPIs and metrics that the organization already tracks. It knows what it cares about. So you probably want to correlate to data that it's already looking at. In that health insurance example that I was just talking about, these risk activities and risk problems were something that the business was already tracking because it was important to them. So they were just able to correlate the KM data to that existing set of data. And then if you want to look at business or KM data that you're not explicitly monitoring already, that data should ideally be something that you can pull out of existing systems. In most cases, it's really outside the scope and capabilities of the KM program to track new business metrics. But if you do get involved with new measures that you can't pull out of existing systems, whether they're KM metrics or whether they're business metrics, you're really going to want to look at those carefully, scrutinize them. I think the first consideration here is, can the measure be clearly defined? I have a lot of members call me up and say, well, we have a new goal to be a learning organization. And I say, okay, What does that mean? How are you going to measure it? And you get a complete blank stare. I don't know. We just want to be a learning organization. We want to be an innovative organization. We want a knowledge sharing culture. These are not things that you can measure unless you define them and assign KPIs to them, create an index of measures that you're going to look at that roll up to being a learning organization, being a knowledge sharing organization. So you need to have those data definitions. Then the next step is this something that can be consistently and effectively measured? And the KM, example that I think of here often is content quality. That can be really subjective and difficult to measure. So you're going to need a robust methodology, for example. And then the third question is really, just because you can measure it doesn't mean that you should measure it. Just because you can collect the data, you really need to look at how much effort it's going to take to clean the data, analyze the data, and weigh that against the potential benefit of getting that data. I think the content quality example is really good here. You may have designed a really robust methodology where 3 different auditors are going to review every piece of content on a 10-point scale on 6 different parameters. And when you add up the amount of time that it actually takes to measure that, it might be equal to everything else you're doing in the KM program just to get that one piece of data. And it may just not be something that makes sense, may not be an investment you want to make. Or it may be something that you want to do on a really limited basis as part of a controlled experiment, but not something that you want to do more broadly. So I have 2 examples of measure portfolios here from our 2021 Excellence in KM recipients. And I'm not going to belabor this, but I just wanted to include some real world examples. This first one is from the Dubai municipality, which is part of the government of Dubai, and they have an integrated KM and innovation program. And they obviously capture activity, what they call operational KPIs, and they also track the maturity of KM and their innovation readiness in that kind of process and maturity categories on our portfolio. But then they also obviously have some impact KPIs, and they have financial ones, they have revenue and cost savings. And they also look at customer satisfaction and the impact of KM and innovation on some really specific business metrics like marine water quality. If they want to increase that, then how is the application of knowledge helping them improve marine quality? Because that's something that's important to the organization. So it's not just how you're saving money, but it's how you're helping to achieve a range of goals and targets. And I think it's really important just to have that holistic view. And then the second example is from Saudi Aramco, and this is specific to their project management office, or PMO. And they capture KM benefits analysis in 4 quadrants that I have here. The first is activity metrics, how much knowledge is being captured from and reused across projects. Is it happening? And then the second category is around recognition, evidence of value, those kinds of success stories. And we're going to talk more about that in a little bit. And then the third category is really cost avoidance measures where they're doing, okay, this lesson we think is worth this much when it's applied, and we've applied it across X number of projects. And that's where you really get that financial impact dollar value. And when you're doing, oil and gas projects, the dollar value can be extremely high from some of these lessons. And then they also look at some non-financial impacts on, well, these processes have been improved, these standard operating procedures have been improved based on the knowledge that we're capturing and that we've been able to apply to make some improvements back into the business. So I think that that's just a good idea of where it makes sense to measure. And now I'm going to pass you off to Darcy to talk a little bit more about the how-to and how you correlate some of the KM and business data.
Great, thanks, Lauren. So I was looking at your Dubai municipality examples and the Saudi Aramco examples, and as I was preparing for today, and I'm thinking, gosh, did they get it right the first time with regard to all those KPIs, all the things that they were measuring, and the impact that they were trying to assess in their organizations? And I'm willing to bet that maybe for some, but not for all of what they're measuring and looking at and reporting out to their sponsors and business stakeholders in their organization. So as we move into the next section on how to measure KM impact, I was thinking about that because, one of the questions is, how do you decide what to measure in order to determine that impact on the business? Some of that goes back to what you were talking about a couple slides ago with regard to practical considerations. Does the data already exist? Do we know what the business is measuring and really what they consider important? Because sometimes what you hear from people in terms of what's important to the business and what the business is actually measuring and tracking can be two different things. So it's important that you have these conversations, right? So, how do you decide when it's not always readily apparent what should be measured? And you may have to make some assumptions when you first get started. So we thought it would be helpful for you all to, we thought we'd share with you all a technique that we use that can help take some of the mystery out of this and help you figure it all out. And so this image here is really talking about that value path for knowledge management. And one of the first things you really have to understand and possibly have a conversation or several conversations with your stakeholders on the business side of things is, how do your KM activities link to what's important to the business, right? And this is a simple depiction of what that could look like in your organization. APQC actually first discovered or developed this model, it was probably about 16, 17 years ago, in one of the first research efforts we ever did looking at how to measure the impact of KM on the business. And what this model depicts here is that your KM investments, your staff resources, IT, operating budget, things like that, those have a direct influence on the effectiveness of your KM activities, which in turn determine the type and the quality of your KM usage or the outputs of those KM activities, which in turn have an impact on the performance of your business processes. And those process outputs ultimately should have an impact on the organization's ability to achieve the business outcomes, those things that are really important to it. So when you're looking at this picture, one of the things I wanted to point out is that those KM investments, those activities, that KM usage or outputs, all of that is above the flow, at least in this image, right? And to a certain extent, that's okay, right? We talked just at the beginning about the portfolio of measures, and you may have some activity measures, and that'll get you to a certain point with regard to your communications and reporting out on how are people involved, how many people are engaged out of our entire target audience, what kinds of things are they engaging in, and their satisfaction with it. That'll take you to a certain point, right? But at some point in your journey with regard to KM and your organization's KM capabilities, you've got to make that decision to say, we need to take it one step further. And how are we going to determine that impact? And to do that, you really have to look at what, here's KM, here's work, how are we bringing them together, and how is KM impacting that work? And we developed a technique called the value path technique that can help you figure all of that out. So as we move to the next slide, we have just a couple of quick steps, and we're going to take you through some examples. There's really, at a high level, two parts to this value path technique. So the first part of it is you have to answer that question, how do our KM activities impact our business processes? What is that linkage? How do they align? How does KM influence those business processes and workflows that are going on a day in, day out, regular basis? The second part of it is then to understand, how do those business processes impact business outcomes? And how do you connect the two together to tell a really complete story? Seems pretty simple, right? So let's show you a couple of examples. So here we have this first example, and you can see here, I'll just talk you through it. So in this example, and this is a real life example, this particular KM team said, if we improve collaboration between R&D and production, we bring them closer together and enable them to share knowledge with each other, then we can reduce the time to respond to issues in the research and development side of things, sometimes even on the production side when they have to go back to R&D to get answers to questions. So if we can improve that collaboration and reduce the time to respond to issues, then we can see that the cycle time to production is decreased. And in the second example, also real life from another organization, their hypothesis or theory was that if we increase the lessons learned capture, the number of lessons learned that we capture, then we can improve the sales process for our organization. And by doing so, then we can impact revenues and see that they are increased. So what I want to point out in these two examples, and these are simplified, but they're two good value paths right here. But what I want to point out here is that the KM outputs, the process performances, the business outputs, all of these things are measurable. Unlike we want to be a learning culture or a knowledge sharing culture. And I'm not trying to poke fun at those things because they're really important things, but those are very high level and they're very, what's the phrase? Motherhood and apple pie. So as Lauren said earlier, you've got to break those down into some component parts and start to decompose those kinds of big strategic motherhood and apple pie goals or objectives and say, how are we going to get there? And a value path activity is basically a series of logic statements, and it can help you figure out how you're going to get there. So on the next slide, this is a view of our value path template, which I want to say that it's available in our resource library along with some information on how to complete it. So if you're interested and want to create some of these for yourselves afterwards, we encourage you to download these. So two parts there, right? Two levels. The first, the KM approach to the business process. What's that linkage? Second, business process to business outcome. Again, what's that linkage? So let's take a look at another example. And this example comes to us from Cognizant Technology, who's also a recipient of the APQC Excellence in Knowledge Management. First, before I get into this, I just want to say that we created this value path based on information they shared with us in their case study. So hopefully if anybody from Cognizant's on, you're looking at this and you're going 2 thumbs up, Darce, this is exactly right. So their hypothesis here was that they believe that by providing sales personnel seamless access to collateral, it would allow them to create better proposals with less effort, leading to a more efficient proposal process and an increased win rate for deals. That's a really concise hypothesis there, a goal right there. And you can break that down into different parts and they can all be measured, right? So let's look at how they broke it down. So in the top 3 box, if you see there, you can see their logic and how they connect their KM approach, the No Hub portal, to the core business process of proposal development. And then they describe what that impact or that linkage is, the reduction in effort to produce proposals, best of breed solutions for future proposals. And then in the second 3 box, what you see is their logic in connecting that business process, proposal development, to business outputs, time per proposal, higher quality proposals, and ultimately to the outcomes, which is increased proposal win rates and increased sales revenue. And one of the keys to this value path is the fact that the KM team was able to connect with the proposal development team and owners, process owners, to confirm that the data that they wanted to collect on that process, the cycle time and the quality, actually existed. Those things were already being measured. So that helped immensely in terms of them saying, okay, we can actually run some tests, a pilot on this, and measure that over a specific period of time to determine if this value path, if we can prove this out and show that impact. And so with this information, the KM team now can report to the sponsor, to their business stakeholders on the impact that KM is having. And I just want to say here that how you communicate the results is just as important as having those results, right? Oh, and there's examples of their results down in the green and purple text boxes at the bottom of the screen. So Lauren, I'm going to turn it back to you to talk about what are some techniques for communicating these results once we have them. We get all excited. Yay, we've got data, we've got results. Now what do we do?
Hey, Lauren, this is Cindy. Can I interrupt you for just 1 minute? I promise not to take long, but I want to point out something and I want this audience to hear this. So look, we just talked about what measures you need, the data information that you want to create. And Darcy talked about thinking about it. When we started our measurement journey at APQC, which was, as I said, over 2 decades ago, we thought that we knew there were 2 issues. We knew there was either a data issue or there was a thinking about it issue. And we went in saying, we've got the data. This is 20 years ago. It's really about how we think about it. So Darcy just described to you how to think about it. So we did that. That was our first exercise with so many of you who've been on this journey with us at APQC. And so now we get ready to go grab all this data. And that's when we realized what we really had was a data problem. Because you want all of these things that Darcy just described. She just showed what Cognizant did. But, and the KM side is the easy side, guys. It's, I promise you, participation, you want to do it consistently. Activity, do it consistently. Just start now. For those of you who said no or anecdotal, just start measuring consistently right now your activities. But then do these value paths because it will save you so much time and effort getting it all ready to go, getting all excited, getting your stakeholders excited about it, and not having the data. Because if it's not there to link to, you have to change it, or you have to start collecting it, and then you go try from a KM team to get the business decide to measure something that you think is important and you hadn't convinced them yet. Lauren's going to talk about this with how to communicate. So I just want you to consider that we would have saved so much time back when had we thought about it, which we did, and then knowing that the data wasn't always going to be there, and the value path allows you to change your course very easily. That it also gives you the big, deep discussion behind it all with your stakeholders. So thanks for letting me interrupt. I think that's a lesson that's so valuable that we've learned over.
And that's all so true, Cindy. And I think the good news is that organizations are slowly and messily working through their data problems, and a lot more of them have data lakes, and then they put it all together and they go, oh, this data's dirty, we need to clean it. And they're bringing in professional, data science people, and data management people to help solve those problems, because everyone wants to be a data-driven organization right now. And then they're like, well, we have a lot of data, but we're driving it into a lake right now because we don't. It's a mess. So
it's messy. Yeah, you're right. That's the problem, is it's messy. And I know we've spent, all of us, years, if not decades, with data analytics. And I think you bring up a good point. Our goal was never to turn your entire KM into a measurement data analytics group. But go find that help. You have it somewhere in your organization, and it'll shorten your time. They're good at it. They can advise you. Use them as a consultant because it really does help. Your process people are the same way. Your Lean Six Sigma guys, they deal with data all the time, and they can help you a lot align those KM measures to those outputs that people really do care about. Yeah.
And I think that's the perfect entree into this final piece of the puzzle around communication. And I have included this great meme here, and I do not have the attribution, so I'll apologize for that. And there were also a bunch of data managers commenting on it as a vast oversimplification, but I like it anyway. I like the story of it, because I think a lot of us are looking at data that is this big pile of Legos. And just like Cindy is saying, we're spending a lot of time trying to sort it, arrange it, put it into a dashboard, and that's great, but you're not done there. It's so much more compelling and meaningful when you can explain it as part of a story. And that's really where you get from here's what happened to here's what we think it means and what we should do based on it. And all of that is so important. So we really want you to be able to tell a compelling KM story. And I think we all love to think about metric analysis as an objective science. The more analytics I'm involved in, the more I realize that there's good and bad practice, obviously, but there's always an element of creative interpretation involved. There's an art and a science to this. And once you've done your analysis, there's even more creative interpretation involved in how you put it together and communicate it as part of a compelling narrative. And as with any, kind of storytelling, you need to think about characters, setting, plot, conflict, and resolution. So a big part of this is knowing your audience. The story you tell to your KM team is going to be very different from what you tell senior leaders, which is different from end users. Not because you're lying to anybody, but just because they care about different things and they want different levels of detail. And then as you tell your story, you need to be aware of the organizational culture, the strategy, the goals. All of that comes into play when you pick your metrics. And it also comes into play in terms of what you emphasize in your story and what you build the story around. You may be able to show that KM both saved money and increased innovation, but at a particular moment in time, one of those may be much more important to your audience than the other. And I think COVID's a great example of this. The KPIs that leaders cared about changed a lot in the course of months. And good KM programs kind of had to shift the story they were telling in their metrics to align with that. So you've just got to be really responsive. And then you want to be clear about both KM's value proposition and how it's delivering that value creation. And again, based on your audience and the level of credibility that you've already built with that audience, that may involve varying levels of show your work. So Mercer is a professional services firm focused primarily on human capital management, health, wealth, and career. And they are a three-peat now recipient of our Excellence in KM recognition. And this summer, I've had the great pleasure of spending some time with the two-person data team that's part of their KM team. So Tommy, I don't know if you're on the line, but I'm going to brag about you and Ryan a little bit here. And this team is really doing a great job of pulling in data from across Mercer. There's Tommy, he is online. So if I get any of this wrong, you can correct me in the chat. And I love their approach because they're really combining some of the hard data and analytics with interviews and focus groups. So if they detect a relationship in the data, then they're also, calling people to say, hey, we saw you downloaded this knowledge asset and the next day you made this sale. Did the knowledge asset help or not? So putting those two things together really allows you to, first of all, verify what you're seeing in the data, because correlation does not equal causation, and then also to tell a more compelling, colorful story. And then the other part that I really like about what they're doing is how they're communicating their insights back to the business. They have multi-channel distribution of insights, and it includes interactive dashboards for people who want to click on things and cut the data and look at it that way. But it's also narrative on text, slides. And then they're also generating 2-3 minute short videos that walk stakeholders through the numbers and tell them what they mean in their context, the context of their business. So there's one thing we know in KM, it's that capturing knowledge and putting it somewhere does not necessarily equate to knowledge transfer or learning. You need to package and deliver knowledge in a way that will be received and absorbed. And I think that that's what's really happening effectively here. You have to figure out what that audience cares about, those characters, what their attention span is. That seems to be decreasing for all of us, minute over minute. How do they best consume information, and then ideally provide some opportunity to really talk to people, to have connection, and to have Q&A. So I think all of that is really powerful. So that is the end of what we wanted to talk about here. We do have lots more information about every aspect of knowledge management measurement in our resource library. I've linked to some of our articles and white papers here at the top, including, I mentioned, we have an article co-authored by Carla Odell, our chairman, around knowledge-sensitive measures. So if that's the direction you're thinking about going in, I think that's a good place to start. We've also got good resources on the value path measurement technique that Darcy was talking about. And then I've also tried to link to all of our case studies and examples that we mentioned over the course of the call. So I know we've got a couple of questions already in queue, and if other people have questions or comments, we will try to pull them out of the Q&A or the chat. But Darcy, you had upvoted a question you said you wanted to answer live here around what is the difference between knowledge management and operational excellence? That question is right up your alley.
Thanks, Lauren. I saw that. I'm going to let Cindy have a first shot at that. Both between the two of us, we'll cover it quite nicely.
You know what? And I probably did that, Lauren, and user error if I did it wrong. Okay, Kevin, I wanted to answer that because I'm going to relate it back to measurement, of course. So the operational excellence is a little bit broader than KM. KM is that discipline that focuses very much on knowledge assets being documented or in somebody's head. And it's building approaches, a systematic approach and processes to help that knowledge flow. And we see a lot of KM programs that are part of operational excellence, which for us typically gets defined a little bit broader, that may include process improvements or Lean Six Sigma. Quality sometimes is under there, although my quality friends, I'm not pushing you there, but it could be there. You just see a lot more things, a broader view of that. I think that's, Lauren, that's about how we look at it. But look, so here's my point about measurement, because as I said, I always, as much as I love measurement, I like to give you shortcuts. If your KM program is part of operational excellence or they're your partners, they usually have a lot of good measures because they're down in the business process. And I will tell you all, we've seen some phenomenal impact on knowledge sharing and transfer to the business process, which in turns, if you value path it, will get to some outcomes some senior leader cares about, quality cost cycle time. So those are really important to partner with them to go find that body of measures that the organization cares about from a process perspective, or even quality. Let me not leave my quality friends out, because chances are they figured out how to measure them at that point. So that's why I voted up that question.
Cindy, that I was thinking many of the same things that you just expressed in terms of the relationship between knowledge management and operational excellence. And we have several members that over the years, we've heard stories from them of how they have leveraged the two together quite successfully. Sometimes they started off two separate, entities within the organization, and then realized, hey, we have some similar goals and we can help each other really work really well together. Sometimes it was by design that they started off together that way. But, I've always felt, and I know many of my colleagues here at APQC are the same, that there just is such a natural synergy there. That the process side of things, the quality side of things, that's the infrastructure that helps our organization operate effectively, and knowledge should flow right through that infrastructure. So if everybody could only learn to work together, we would be able to become that knowledge sharing culture, that learning organization so much more quickly.
And then the next question that we have here is around, I think, how do you show, if you can assign dollar value, what are other metrics? And I know this came in a little earlier in the session, so hopefully we've kind of gotten into that a little bit. But I do just kind of want to mention here the importance of having those conversations with your key stakeholders out in the business and saying, what metrics are important to you? Where are you trying to drive improvements? And I think that pulls into the operational excellence piece as well. And they won't always say, well, I mean, if you're talking to sales, they'll probably say I want to drive higher revenue. But if you're looking at other parts of the business, they may have a very different set of metrics. And I think being able to help them achieve those goals, regardless of how well you can measure it, if they see that value. I think in June, Kim Glover from Technique FMC was on talking about the return on expectation for KM. So I do feel like that's an important part of the qualitative picture as well as the metric picture as well. And then we've also got a question around, can you share examples around measuring KM engagement across different levels of stakeholders? Either of you want to take a stab at that one?
Lauren, I'll start it in just our time. I want to, and Karen Boudelier Brown had a fabulous question too, so maybe it'll help. Karen, this will help you as well. So that was going to be another tip that I have. Again, I said start out, if you're not measuring anything, just you've got to start with your activities in KM, then and do that consistently and try to be relevant. If your approach is communities, participation is important, but probably the quality of participation, so getting the people you need at the table at the community meeting is going to be an important thing to look at, because then you can say, if we're talking about lessons and they need to be taken back and applied to something to reduce defects, we've seen this before, did that happen? So that's number one. The second one is, and I think Kevin said this too, talking about change management and getting your stakeholder involved. That is where that's where the rubber meets the road. If you can start your value path and then take them to your stakeholder, and Karen, this will require much deeper conversation, we'll have it. But you've got to be able then to let them say, yeah, this is what we want to see. Let's go measure it, bring it back to them, and you'll have them as a partner forever. You'll get to continue on if they get to be part of the measurement equation.
Yeah, I think people really want to see their own experience reflected in those measures, and if you can combine them with the stories, it's incredibly powerful. Cindy, did you have? I think we have time for maybe one more quick question. Did you say you saw something in the chat?
There's a few things, and there's some really good examples about looking at knowledge management and content management and getting to that outcome, which I think Karen said theirs is getting to time to live for implementing their product for customers. So if that's your ground, that's your anchor of where you need to get, back it up where you would start looking at how content management and what you're doing will drive to that, all the way from uploads, downloads, usage. You may have to do some investigation for that or some surveys. You may can do some proxies that will let you know it's being used. But that's the way to drive it. It'll probably take several steps, Karen. We've had a bunch of good comments and chat on that.
Excellent. Well, I think this has been
a great. I
told
her we needed 3 hours for this. I told her that. I said, this is a 3-hour conversation. She said,
at a minimum.
Yeah.
Well, and I'm hoping between now and the end of the year to put together an APQC member roundtable where hopefully we can talk a little bit more with people, more of a interactive conversation about some of the ideas and tactics and what's working for people and what isn't. So hopefully this will not be the end of the conversation, but it is the end of our hour. So I am going to thank everybody. Thank you, Darcy and Cindy, for helping me talk about measurement, and thanks to everyone for joining. And I hope to see you all next month when we are going to talk about KM trends.
Thanks, guys. Thanks, Lauren. Bye, everyone.
Bye for now.